Wait, no, please. That's the real one.
Oh, we got a second. There we go. We finally got a second one.
Wait. Okay, so let's see. Take out the.
See if we close this one. It's not streaming.
Or maybe put it after. Oh, what is the air? Latin shoot. Latin shoot. You're in a competition or flat? What is that?
How did you get a 90? When you put content.id, doesn't know what content.id is.
What?
I know this is why.
So if you know what that is.
Like to
Oh, components in the other. Yes, probably.
Then I have to make these classes
And also, like, it's gonna be cool
No,
if
it
you're
only.
And then we're done.
your job, and you can more than just go get it. That's really You can see the TV, right? That's why I didn't see that. Yeah.
That is the thing they keep
This is
telling
what
me.
two goes with the state last season.
All right.
It was
It works with one.
All right. How's the afternoon? Chatty fun? Ish? Cool. All right. Well, we got a few more things to talk about, and then we'll have finished off Twitter. See if this computer dies from heat exhaustion. All right. Where did we leave off? Let's make sure we're on the same page here. I think it was that I had number 12 still. So yeah, I think that's where it was. Last time we set up an event handler, trigger an update to the content on input. That happened a little bit early, I recall. And that was just in here, when we change the text area, we want to make sure that we update the content so we get that controlled component behavior. So now we have that. And we need to go into the next step, which is pass a function to the header that it can call when a new post is created. So I feel like we're kind of at the right time for this, because we have to do this with our chat bar too, right? So I'm going to create that just based on our diagram here. It's the app that is going to pass a function to the header. So the header will receive a prop called maybe on post or on new post or something like that. On new message, whatever you want to call it. And so that means that the app is the one that creates that function, or that has that function inside of it. So I just create that function here. And what we pass to this function is just the content that we want to post. It's a very simple interface. Call this function, give me a string, and I'll post that to the server for you eventually. For now, though, we're going to just print it out to make sure it works. Right? This is a good way to test to make sure we don't go too far. So I have this on post function. I now need to pass that down to the header. So I'm going to go and create a prop for the header, on new post equals, and then this dot on new post. And that's going to work fine for us right now. And the reason why is because I'm not accessing this anywhere in this function. And if I was accessing this, then I would have problems. I would need to bind it first. But I'm not doing that yet. I will bind it when it becomes a problem. I could anticipate it, but you know. I'm not using this yet. All I want to do is confirm that when I call this function and pass it content, it prints out that content for me. Inside the header, we call on new post, so we go down here. And there's this button here, the post button. That thing needs an event handler. So normally what I would do is I would say on click. That's going to be the event that I'm going to listen for. And when we receive a click, we're going to take that event, and we're just going to call this .props.on new post. That's the thing coming from the app, right? This .props.on new post that comes from the app. And I don't know, new data, whatever, just something. Or a new tweet. Posted. So now I would just expect that when I type in here and click on this, it doesn't really matter what I type because I've hard-coded this value, but that interface is working for us. That function's being called by the child component, and it just hard-coded that data. So instead of hard-coding it, I could say this.state.content down here. And now when I type something in here, that's what gets printed out. So I'm successfully passing that back to the app. All right. I would say that I have pass a function to the header so that it can call when a new post is created. That requirement is done. It's not very useful yet, but that requirement is complete. So I'm going to move on to the next thing. And I'm going to set up an event handler to use the function as a prop, or pass as a prop. Okay, did that. Right, I kind of jumped ahead there. Number 13, that's done. I did that right here. Now this creates a new function every time I render this. And I said that's not a good thing. So maybe what I would do in this situation is create onPost event and have that call my function for me. Right? That creates the function once when the component is initialized or instantiated. And then in the onClick, we just say this.onPost, which is not the one passed to props. It's a function that wraps that. And the reason why we don't just directly call this.onNewPost is because we need to pass it this parameter still somewhere. So this is a good place to do that. Now I expect there to be an error. I type in, I hit post, yep, cannot read property, props of undefined. Okay. So that means the context of this is incorrect here, and I can go up and fix it. Now, testing, post, and I get my testing output right here. Okay, cool. So that's now working pretty well, and I like the fact that it's using a single function, does not get recreated. Set up an event handler, and we did that. In the header, create the error state. Oh, we're going to move away from, now that we can post content, we can click that button and have it do something. In the header, create the error state that passes a prop to the status. Okay. So that means, remember with Tweeter, when you click that button, you check to see whether or not the content was 0 characters or greater than 140, and based on that, you showed one message or the other. That's what we have to do right now. And we want to actually display the error in the status bar. So we're going to pass the error as a property to the status bar. The first thing we should do is add that state, default state here, as an empty string. We'll just say that this header there's a possible error. At the very beginning there is no error, so we'll just have it as an empty string. But later on we'll set state and we'll set error to be whatever message we want to show the user. And then we pass that error onto the status bar here as a third property, this.state.error. Now when I go in, I can actually look at my React header state here, and I can change this and say tweet is too short. Okay. Now my status bar is passed that data as a property. So whatever my error says in the header, that'll be passed to the status bar, and the status bar is only responsible for rendering that thing. It doesn't change it, it doesn't clear it, it just shows what it's given. Always just shows what it's given. And it will do that right here. This.props.error. So now, oh right, not this.props is a function-based component, so I shouldn't put this in front of it. Okay. Now it's working again, good. And I go to React, and I go to my header, and I change this error, tweet is great, and there it shows up now. Okay. But we want to modify that error based on that condition when we click that button. So what function gets called as soon as we click that button? On click, we'll call this dot on post. Okay, so we have this function up here. And under what situation do we actually want to pass the data back up?
It's less than
If it's a valid tweet, right? If it does not, if it's not too short, if it's not too long, then we should post it. But if it's too short or too long, we don't even send that data back to the app. So here's it's really good we made this function because there's going to be more going on inside of it. If we had just embedded this inline in our render call, it would start to become quite big and harder to manage. So it's kind of nice to have this as a separate function because here we can say if this dot content or state dot content dot length is greater than max characters, we have this still, right? Or this dot state dot content dot length, that's getting kind of annoying. Const length equals this dot state dot content dot length. If the length is greater than the max characters, or the length is equal to 0, why don't we just return and never get there in the first place? Never send that message. For now, that should work, right? In the case that we try and post, no message, A, AB, that's all good. No posting, right? So this is now preventing a post and it's starting to do a little bit of that validation. But we don't want to stop there because we want to actually change the error message based on which condition is not being met. So here we could say, if the length is greater than max characters, this dot set state will change the error and we'll make it tweet is too long. That looks good to me. And then maybe we just return from that because we don't want we don't necessarily need to execute any other code if that's the case. We've already hit that. We don't need to check if it's 0. It's not going to be 0 if it's greater than max characters. I guess unless max characters is -1, I don't know. That sounds stupid. So I'm going to take this set state here. I'm going to put it down here, and I'm going to say that in the case that length is 0, tweet must have content. I don't know. So now, tweet must have content. That's going to work just fine. And then I can post too many characters. Tweet is too long. So it's this condition here that's setting the state based on it. Now, I noticed something. When the tweet is just right, it tries to post it. We're seeing that over in the output. But what is not happening? I need a little bit louder. I kind of heard someone, but there's two things actually.
Well, the error message is still there.
It's still there even though there's no error.
Yeah.
So we should fix that, right? What we'll do is down here we'll say this dot set state error empty string again. Okay, so that fixes one problem, right? Where we make an error and then we try and then we don't. Good, error's gone and it tried to post them. What else is the problem? One more. I want to post another tweet. Okay, well, I'll delete this, and then I'll go and post another tweet. And I'll post it, and I want to post another tweet, so I'll delete this. So the issue is that our content doesn't get reset when we actually successfully post. We don't want to reset the content if there's an error, because we want people to be able to fix the content they have. But we do want to reset the content when they've successfully posted, because they're likely not going to want to post the exact same tweet again. So here, we would change another piece of state called content and make it empty string again. This is what I love about connected components, is that by changing the state, my component will update. If we didn't have a connected component, we would have to do something like maybe, I don't know, through the event, we might be able to grab that input field and then set the value back to empty string. But then we're just changing DOM directly, and that's an anti-pattern, right? So by having this slight two-way binding with our forms, it really helps us solve that problem. Okay. I would say that we probably want to move this up, right? We'll add the new post with the content, and then we will reset the content. We probably don't want to reset the content and then send the post. Likely it'll work because these things are asynchronous, and I bet that state has not been updated by then, but we don't even want to risk it. We want to know that and then make our code. We want to write our code knowing that. So I think that this feature is looking a little bit better now. It looks like it's going to work. Good? 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 Good. Back to normal. Very good. I just tested every scenario that my code is meant to handle, right? I tested each of the code paths. This one, and this one, both before and after. Okay. We can feel good about that? All right. All this state belongs in the header, and the status bar is just rendering what it's told to render. Awesome. All right, show the error text if it is not empty. Yeah, we're doing that. I kind of messed this up in the sense that if the error is empty, it will just not show anything. But this whole thing still exists here. Sometimes you want to conditionally render this. You want to say, if there's an error, I want to render this part of the DOM, and if there is no error, then I don't want to render it at all. So let me just show you what conditional rendering would look like in this situation. We could actually say, if props.error is true, then we do this. Otherwise, we do empty. Right? So now we're actually going to get a little bit of a different behavior when we look at our React debugger here. Inside the status bar, right now, no error to be seen, right? And as soon as I create an error, there it is. And as soon as I clear the error, it's gone again. And it's replaced by this empty string. That's what this condition is doing right here. If props.error has a truthy value, then render this thing, else render nothing. Okay. This is good if you want to render one thing or the other, but I don't think it's the best solution if we want to just render something or not render it. Those are two different things, right? I could say, in this case, render a span without an error thing. I don't know why I would do that. For me, this makes a bit more sense to use the ternary operator when I have one thing or the other. Right? Either the error span or the span. Well, that's interesting. It actually keeps it in there. Yes. Okay, so what I would do in this case is use the recommended way that React wants us to, the React documentation tells us to do it this way. Kind of weird, right? Okay, let's talk about this because it's actually really cool. And it works in the same way that you would expect. We look at the elements here. When there is no error, great, we're getting an empty string. There is an error, now we get the span and we put something back in and we don't get that anymore. So it's working the same way. Tell me what this condition results to. Is that true? Yeah? Okay, so the first thing that happens, true, yeah, that's true, good. So we'll go and look at the next thing right here. True, okay, it's all true, so it all works, right? Like that is a true statement. What about this one? And shortcut, right? False, okay, we're done looking. That's what we get back from this expression, is false. What about why would it be false? Does this pass?
Yeah.
Okay, and is this a truthy value? It will return a React element. It will return an object, and an object. It's fair that that's not super clear, but this returns an object. It's not undefined.
So now it's just true.
It would be truthy, and therefore, what we actually end up getting is not true, but the actual value of this thing, which is a React element, and that's what we're putting on the state, or in the DOM, so it renders it just fine. So when we do this, we're saying, if this is truthy, then what we actually want to put down is this thing here. It's the last thing in the expression will be used. So this is sort of what I would recommend, and we'll look at the React docs quickly. And I'm going to show you where this is, under conditional rendering right here. If anyone has not read the entire main concepts of this documentation, drop everything and do it. It's so good. Conditional rendering, maybe not drop everything, you still got stuff to do. But really, if by the end of the week you haven't found the time to do this, before you start your project and you're using React, read the main concepts. The advanced guide, you can get away with not doing that, but the main concepts, you're going to find some stuff out based on this, I promise you. And one of those things that you might find out is inline if with the logical AND operator. You may embed any expression in JSX by wrapping them in curly braces. We know that already. This includes the JavaScript logical AND operator. It can be handy for conditional including an element. That's what they're doing here. They're saying that if the unread message's length is greater than 0, then render this part of the DOM. And if this is false, then they render false, and false is basically a no operation. When we try and render false or true to the DOM, it doesn't show anything, just like empty string, just like null, right? So it works because in JavaScript, true and expression always evaluates to expression. And false and expression always evaluates to false. Therefore, if the condition is true, the element right after the and will appear in the output. If it is false, React will ignore and skip it. And that's really what we're getting out of this. I talked about this with the ternary operator, so you can use that if you have one thing or the other, not just like a on or off. And we won't go much farther. I just want to tell you about this because it's super useful. I find doing that in our code is a little bit nicer. All right. Switch from hard-coded posts to JSON that uses, so now we're getting into Ajax. And you're not going to have to do that this week. But I added this because I get to final projects and people will say, how do I make a request to my server with React? And it's the same way you do it within jQuery or any other client-side code. You make an Ajax request. It doesn't even have to be Ajax specifically. It doesn't have to be $.ajax. That would be if you had jQuery, but we don't have jQuery. So what I'm going to use is something else called the fetch API, which is actually now what's built into the browsers. Before Ajax, there was no way to do it. Or in the browser, you would use something called an XML HTTP request, which is a horrible name because it doesn't really describe what it is. But it was a way for someone to be able to download XML without reloading the page. We don't use XML anymore, but we're still living with the name of this function that exists. So they wrap that thing in something called Ajax and provide it to you through jQuery with a whole bunch of shortcut functions, make it really nice. At some point, the browsers looked at this and said, everyone wants to do this, so we should add something that allows them to do that, and we'll call it the fetch API. This is what it looks like when I've wrapped this up in my own code here. This is not really part of the lesson, but it's something we can learn. I created a class called API, and I created something called static methods on it. So I don't need to create an instance of API in order to use these functions. I don't have to say, I don't know, new API, right? Normally you might have to do something like var API equals new API. That would be how I could create a new instance of this class. But this class actually has static methods, so I'm able to do API.get and API.post. Those static methods can be called directly like that. But they're just wrapped up in an object. And what we do is we call fetch, and we give it a URL. This credentials include is just making sure that our cookies get passed. Fetch requires us to pass cookies along. Then we get a response back, and we need to convert that response to JSON, so we return another, something that will resolve another promise. And so what we can actually do is say API.get /messages .then messages come in, and then we can use this to this .set state. And this code belongs in our app component. When we mount it, we should make our API request. So, app, component, did mount. When it mounts, the first thing we're going to do is set our post to be an empty array. So there will be no posts. I won't import hard-coded posts anymore. And I will comment this out for now. So what happens is I reload Tweeter, and sure enough, app has 0 posts in the array. Because it's initialized to an empty array. But the app still works because I can map over an empty array easily. I don't have to double check to make sure that it has a value. If I set this to null initially, this could cause a problem, right? Because what does it do? It tries to, cannot read property map of null. Of course you can. That doesn't exist on null. So that's why I think it's a really good idea to initialize your arrays to empty arrays at the beginning. And then you don't need to do as many checks to see whether or not the value is null before you use it. Okay? So now what I need to do is, as soon as the component is mounted, I'm going to retrieve those messages from my API. It's going to give those to me because I've done the response.json, it's converted it for me. I don't need to do a JSON parse for this. I will receive the messages, and I will replace this post array with my messages array instead. Oh, API is not defined, that's fair. Import API from with. Okay, so it's even hard to see. We don't see how fast it is, but it is. It's rendering once. The component is mounted, makes the request, gets it back fast enough, re-renders, and then so we're actually get two renders here as a result of this. And my posts object now has 12 items in it, and it's gotten from the server now. If I were to modify the server and refresh, I get those new posts. Is that okay? I mean, no, this is quick. It's good for review later. Again, it's not needed this week, but I want to make sure people see how to do AJAX requests. Okay. So we've done this, and so now our posts are no longer hard-coded. What we want to do I would say, as the last required step, is save the new post in the database in that post handler that we created. The thing that was writing out to the console, we should make an API request to send to the server instead. So here, where that on new post, we get the content, and what we would do is say api.post. It's still the messages API. It's just a post on it now. And I have one more piece of information I can pass it, which is an object that contains the body that I want to post to the server. And this is just through my API helper that I've created. When I do that, I stringify that data and pass it as a body through fetch. Okay? Fetch is one option. Another good option is Axios. And I would use fetch or Axios. I probably wouldn't bother using anything else in your final projects or in any future apps. I would not install jQuery to use Ajax, because then you get a whole bunch of other stuff that you don't need. Whereas Axios is meant just to be a library to do requests. Fetch is the one built into the browser. In the situation that someone is using Internet Explorer 11, they might not have fetch. That's okay, we can polyfill it. Does anybody do people know what polyfill is? What a polyfill would be? Okay, that's okay. I don't think I taught you week 2 ES6 stuff. So we're able to modify our JavaScript before we send it, before we actually send it in the browser. Like the code that we write is not actually the code the browser is reading, because it goes through Webpack in this situation, or Babel, let's say, right? So we can make modifications to our code. That means that we could actually embed some code in that checks to see whether or not fetch is something that exists. And if it doesn't exist, then let's implement it ourselves through JavaScript. That's a polyfill. Fill in gaps for browsers that don't have the features. So Internet Explorer 11, no fetch. That's no problem. Our code checks. Fetch is undefined. Then let's create a function called fetch that does all the exact same stuff that the browser fetch does. Just a little slower, right? Because it's implemented in JavaScript rather than in the browser itself. That's a bit of an aside. But fetch might need to be polyfilled if you need to use it in older browsers, like Internet Explorer 11, which is really the only one we worry about anymore. We don't worry about IE 6 or 8 or any of that anymore. It's just IE 11, and once that's gone, we're doing pretty well. A lot of this stuff is no longer as big of an issue. And the reason why is because Microsoft has moved to Edge, so my Internet Explorer 11 will never be updated ever, because Edge is getting all the new features. Okay. So here, the data that I'm going to pass in is something called content, and the reason I know that is because my API is set up for it. So I just go down to server, routes, messages, and I take a look at post, and post is looking for something called request.body.content. So therefore, I'm going to create a property called content and pass that on the body. Content is going to be equal to content. This content was passed in over here. There's a shorthand that we can use if we have those things matching, remember? Content equals content, good. Then when we receive this response back, I actually really don't care what comes back. So, maybe I'll leave it at this. Oh, I lost my pen. Oh, that's enabled ones. I'll bring back later. It's not almost done. So here, I should be able to now, maybe I can post a new tweet. Does this work? And it does. It's posted. But it didn't do it automatically. I have to, what about this? I have to reload, right? And why do we think that is?
Not seeing the set state change.
Yeah, there is no set state change. When I make the post, that's all good, but I never get the messages again. Like remember when you had to make another request to the server after you posted your tweets. You got back the list of all of the tweets, including the newest one, and then you did a render tweets again. We need to do the same thing here. We need to essentially do this again. Okay. So what about this one? Oh, there's a problem. What does it say? Anyone want to guess? This.setState is not a function. Fine, yeah. Because now we're using this context inside of this function, and on new post is not bound. So therefore, we will do that. Now it's working. I don't love this duplication. So what I might do in this situation is create a function called load. Call it here. And then also call it down here. Still works, but now I have just that one function for getting the data declared here. So that's probably the change I would make. And actually, when we have something like this, where we have an empty, or sort of like an anonymous function wrapping a function that it just calls immediately, and that's all that happens, I might even get away with passing that as the function it calls when the promise is resolved. See if that works. Works? Nope. Cannot read property set state of undefined. That's no problem. Works again. I'm okay with binding here because on new post only gets called when someone clicks the button, when they actually type in a tweet. It's not like render that gets called sort of randomly and whenever. It gets called maybe a few times for a user, and so it's not super costly. You could just as easily do the binding up here instead with load. I just wanted to kind of show you that there are situations where this to me is a little bit more clean. Just not in the render. All right, we still got time. So we got number 18 here, which is toggle the visibility of the compose window. when I go in here and I click this button, I want to show and hide this part here. So I go into my header and I find the button that's responsible for that. It's right here. It's the compose button. And I say that on click will do this dot on compose. Okay, and I'll create a function here called on compose. And this thing here is actually going to change the visible state of this component. But maybe I should actually track that. Visible? Should we start true or false? Should the compose window be there by default or not? No, false. And so now we have this piece of state that as it changes, we can conditionally render part of our DOM. And that part of the DOM would be this whole thing here. It's the whole text area, status bar, and button that we want to show and hide. But we want to keep the brand and the logo and the compose click button, right? So this is a good opportunity. This dot state dot visible key binding is killing me. Kind of like to do it maybe like this. Maybe that's a little bit nicer. I'm so trapped when I don't have my binding. It's like I'm in a box in the ground or something. Right, it's not showing by default because our app or our header has the visible state of false. We can bring it back and forth just by changing that state. So this is kind of cool. Remember changing the state over here in these debug tools that people tend not to use a lot? It helps. I can just make sure that that actually works before I go through the hassle of setting the state myself. Now that I know that this works, all I have to do is go inside this function here and say that this.setState visible is going to be true now. Or, of course, on compose, we'll bind that. Okay. It's not going away. It's okay that we wrote code that it shouldn't go away. We're setting it to true, and one time now it never goes back. What would I do logically to make this toggle back and forth? Let's say let is visible if this dot state dot visible is equal to true, then is visible equal to false. Is this fun for anyone? It's not fun for me. Else if this dot, or maybe we just do else here, is visible is true, then okay, that toggles it, right? Because basically if it is visible right now, then I'll set it to false, and if it's not, I'll set it to true. Well, that's working. What about changing this a little bit and just saying instead that if, forget this extra variable, what do people prefer? Does the same thing. What do we prefer? Is there any problem with doing it this way? It's still just one set state call, right? Like it's still just one render. It's just two code paths. Okay, I got a better idea. What about this instead? Is that nicer? I don't know. Arguably, maybe. Does the same thing. Okay, so but it's still doing the same thing. At least now we just have the one set state, so it's a little less confusing what's going on. Is there a better way to do this?
Not equal.
Not equal. Great. That works too. Is anyone confused by this? Yeah? Okay. So when I put this in front of an expression, true or false, it will essentially return the inverse of that expression. So if this value is true and I say not true, it would be false, and if I say not false, it would be true, and therefore I'm assigning that opposite value back to visible, and it's just going back and forth. Every time I click it, that value changes. Now, we know that using this dot state inside of these objects could come up with some problems now, right? Could I possibly maybe hit it so fast that we batch up some state changes? I'm probably not going to notice with this. But I'd say at this point is a good time to think about prev state in here and using prev state instead, because then we know that even if it batches these things up, should be good. That frustrates me. I'd never done that in the lecture before because we never really got that far, but because yesterday's material was full of it, I thought what a cowboy. Okay, it's fine. We got time. I can debug this a little bit. Because it should still work, right? Like we should be able to. This should just pass us whatever the current state is. We should be able to use that to check stability. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that down and. Oh, of course. It's a problem between the chair and the keyboard. Return, right? This has to return an object. Anytime if I actually return null from this, it results in do not update, do not render. So you can actually use that to your benefit later on if you want, but we do have to make sure we return an object if we want it to change. And so this should work now. And I don't know if anyone noticed this, but this is not required in single line arrow functions, right? I don't need to actually return if it's a single expression. But JavaScript gets a little bit confused by this, where I'm actually saying I want to return this object, right? And the implicit return doesn't work because it considers this to actually be the function instead. So in order to fix this, we can actually wrap this up with parentheses, or with brackets. Yeah, I guess they're the same thing, sorry. And that should still work. So this here is actually now returning an object implicitly. All right. Well, that's everything that was on my list. Do we have anything we want to go over a little bit more?
What about the names? Like you have the same name in the database, and you change that to separate users in the computer?
Oh, so.
Because you have just like one person that the one
Yeah, that's me. And if I look at my application and my cookies, I am user number 4. What happens if I'm user number 2? We'll see. I don't know. Let's try this. Oh, now I'm Tara Eaton. So it's just a matter. You never saw this, but if you're curious about the way the server is set up, I actually have it so that every time someone makes a request, this is a piece of middleware in my Express server. Every time someone makes a request, it checks to see if there's a cookie. If there is no cookie, create a user, and that just creates a user with a random name, and then it sets the cookie, and now I'm that user forever, or at least until I change the cookie, right? Otherwise, if there is a cookie, well, just continue on as if nothing happened, right? So this is how that user behavior is. As soon as, if I don't have, if I remove this instead, I'm going to get rid of all of these, and I reload this app, I'm now going to be new user, and I should be, now I'm Katharina Kaz, user number 5. That was more functionality with my server than anything. Cool. How do we feel? I feel good. Okay. Well, hey, we finished early. That was pretty quick. I don't know. I don't want to fill the time if I don't need to. For sure, no questions. Nothing else you want to talk about? I got 10 minutes. I got 15. I got 20. I got whatever. Okay. Great. If one, some, or all of you want to get together as a group and talk about something at a smaller group, that's fine. We can do that too. But anyone who is done can definitely leave. I'll stick around for another few minutes to see if anyone wants to talk about anything. Cool. The notes will be exactly the same as this morning. I don't have anything new. It's all the same.